Surah Al-Anfal. Surah Al-Anfal consists of 75 verses and is included in the Madaniyyah surah group because all of its verses were revealed in Medina. This chapter is called al-Anfal, which means spoils of war, because the word al-Anfal is found at the beginning of this chapter, and also the issues that stand out in this chapter are about spoils of war, the laws of war, and matters related to war in general. According to the history of Ibn Abbas, R.A., this chapter was revealed in connection with the Badr Kubra war, which occurred in the second year of the Hijrah. This war is very important because it was the one that determined the historical path of Islamic development. At that time the Muslims, with a small force, were for the first time able to defeat the polytheists, who were large in number and well equipped, and in this war they obtained quite a lot of booty. Therefore the problem arose of how to divide the spoils of war, and then Allah revealed the first verse of this chapter. The main contents of Surah Al-Anfal. The spoils of war belong to Allah and the Messenger. In Surah Al-Anfal verses 1-4, Allah explains that the spoils of war belong to Him and His Messenger. Muslims must fear Allah, improve their relationships with each other, and obey Allah and His Messenger. The characteristics of believers are those whose hearts tremble when the name of Allah is mentioned, their faith increases when they hear His verses, and they rely only on their Lord. Believers are those who perform prayers and give alms from the sustenance that Allah has given them. They are the true believers who will receive a high rank in the sight of God, forgiveness, and noble sustenance. The reluctance of some believers to go to the Battle of Badr. In Surah Al-Anfal verses 5-8, Allah ordered the Prophet Muhammad to leave his house with the truth, even though some of the believers did not like it. They denied the truth of the Battle of Badr after the victory occurred, as if they were being led to death. Allah promised the Prophet that one of the groups he faced would be his, even though the Prophet wanted those who did not have weapons. Allah established Islam as true by His provisions, while He destroyed the infidels down to their roots, even though the polytheists did not like it. Allah's help to the Muslims in the Battle of Badr. Surah Al-Anfal verses 9-14. Allah provided help to His people by sending 1,000 angels as reinforcements, which was actually just good news and to calm the hearts. Victory comes only from Allah, the Almighty and the Most Wise. Allah gives peace by ushering in sleep, sending rain to purify and strengthen, and eliminating Satan's interference. Allah gave revelations to the angels to give confidence to the believers and to instill fear in the disbelievers who oppose Allah and His Messenger, with the threat of harsh punishment. The worldly punishment inflicted on unbelievers is a sign of the punishment of hell for them. Prohibition of fleeing from the battlefield. Surah Al-Anfal verses 15-19. Allah commands the believers not to turn their backs on the infidels who are attacking, because retreating except for war strategy or joining other troops will bring Allah's wrath and hell as a bad place to return to. It is Allah who actually kills and throws, and He gives victory to the believers. Allah weakened the deception of the disbelievers, and the verdict of victory has come for the Muslims. If the disbelievers ask for a verdict, they will be defeated, and Allah is always with the believers. Prohibition of turning away from the commands of Allah and His Messenger. Mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 20-23, Allah commands believers to obey Him and His Messenger, and not to turn away from Him even if they hear His commands and prohibitions. They are prohibited from being like hypocrites and polytheists who only claim to listen without practicing it. Allah states that the worst creatures in His sight are those who are deaf and dumb, namely those who do not want to hear and do not want to say the truth because of ignorance. If Allah knows there is good in them, He will give them the ability to hear, but if given such ability, they would still turn away and turn away. Obligation to fulfill the call of Allah and His Messenger. Mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 24-26, Allah commands believers to fulfill the call of Him and His Messenger when they are called to something that gives life, because Allah is the one who divides between humans and their hearts, and in the end they will be gathered to Him. Believers are asked to protect themselves from Allah's torment, which can befall anyone, not just unjust people. Allah reminds Muslims that when they were oppressed in Mecca, Allah gave them a safe place to live in Medina, providing help, strength, and good fortune so that they would be grateful. Prohibition of treason and commandment of piety. Mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 27 to 29. Allah commands believers not to betray Him, His messenger, and the mandate entrusted to them, because that is an act that is not right. The wealth and children you have are only a test, and with Allah there is a great reward. Believers are asked to fear Allah because with piety, Allah will give them the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, erase mistakes and forgive their sins because Allah has great grace. The deception of the mushriks against the Prophet, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 30 to 37. Allah reminded the Prophet Muhammad about the tricks planned by the unbelievers to detain him, kill him, or expel him, but Allah retaliated against these tricks with the best of His ability. When the verses of the Quran were recited to them, the disbelievers considered them mere fairy tales and asked for a painful punishment if the Quran was the truth. However, Allah did not punish them as long as the Prophet Muhammad was among them, and as long as they asked for forgiveness. Unbelievers who prevent believers from worshipping at the Grand Mosque will experience defeat and be punished in hell as a result of their acts of disbelief and spending wealth to obstruct Allah's path. Allah will separate the bad from the good, and the disbelievers will be piled together in hell as losers. Threats to hypocrites and the order to maintain religion, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 38 to 40. Allah ordered the Prophet Muhammad to convey to the disbelievers that if they stop their disbelief and enter Islam, their past sins will be forgiven, but if they return to fighting the Prophet, the same rules of Allah will apply as for the previous people. Allah's command is to fight them until there is no more slander, and religion belongs entirely to Allah. And if they stop disbelieving, Allah is all-seeing of what they do. Allah confirms that if they turn away, He is the best protector and best helper for Muslims. Terms of distribution of Ghanima, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verse 41. Allah ordered that 1/5 of the spoils of war be given to Allah, the Messenger, the Prophet's relatives, orphans, the poor, and Ibn Sabil. This applies to those who believe in Allah and what He revealed to the Prophet Muhammad on the day the two armies met. Allah confirms that He is all-powerful over all things. The Battle of Badr, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 42 to 44. Allah describes a situation where the Muslims were on the edge of a valley, close to the city of Medina, while the enemy was on the edge of a valley far away, but the enemy caravan was lower. Although there were differences of opinion in determining the day of the battle took place according to the will of Allah to show clear evidence for those who are destroyed and those who are alive. Allah also showed the Prophet Muhammad in a dream the number of enemies was small, because if their number was large, the Muslims would be afraid and arguments would arise, but Allah saved them because He is the most merciful, knowing what is in the hearts. Allah shows the enemies to the believers in small numbers, both according to their vision and the vision of the enemy, to carry out the affairs that must happen, because all affairs are returned only to Allah. War ethics, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 45 to 47. Allah commands the believers that when they encounter enemy troops, they must be steadfast, chant the name of Allah as much as possible, and obey Allah and His Messenger without arguing, which can make them afraid and lose strength, and be patient because Allah is always with those who are patient. Allah also forbids them from becoming arrogant and proud when they leave their hometown, and prevents other people from Allah's path because Allah is all-knowing of all the deeds they do. Satan's promise to the polytheists and the hypocrites' taunts to the believers at the Battle of Badr, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 48 to 49. Allah reminds us of how Satan makes sin seem beautiful to humans, tempting them with promises of victory and help, but when the battle actually occurs, Satan retreats and expresses his fear of Allah. Allah confirms that Satan is very cunning, and his punishment is very harsh. In addition, Allah also mentions hypocrites and those who have disease in their hearts who try to lead the believers astray by saying that they are being deceived by their religion. But Allah emphasizes that whoever puts their trust in Him will definitely gain strength and wisdom from Him. The dying condition of the polytheists and hypocrites, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 50 to 54. Allah describes how the angels take the lives of the disbelievers with great torment, hitting their faces and backs while telling them to feel the burning torment as a result of what their own hands have done, for Allah is not unjust to his servants. They will experience a torment like the followers of Pharaoh and those before them who denied the signs of Allah, so Allah punished them for their sins. Allah will not change the favor he has bestowed upon a people unless they change themselves. The followers of Pharaoh and those before them were drowned and destroyed by Allah because of their injustice. Betrayal of the Bani Qurayza Jews. Mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 55 to 59. Allah explains that those who disbelieve are the worst creatures in his sight because of their lack of faith. Those who betray the agreement are not pious, and violate the promises that have been made must be faced firmly in war to teach them a lesson. If the Prophet Muhammad was worried about the betrayal of a people, the agreement had to be returned in a fair and honest way, because Allah does not like traitors. Unbelievers should not feel safe from Allah's power because they are unable to resist him. Building strength in facing the enemies of Islam, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verse 60. Allah ordered Muslims to prepare themselves as best as possible to face their enemies, both in terms of strength and cavalry. With this preparation they can make God's enemies, their own enemies, and other parties they don't know afraid. Although Muslims do not know their true enemies, Allah does. Allah guarantees that everything spent in His way will be repaid with kindness without any injustice to Muslims. Call for peace and vigilance. Mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 61 to 66. Allah commanded the Prophet Muhammad that if the enemy is inclined towards peace, then the Prophet Muhammad must also be inclined towards him and put his trust in Allah, because only Allah is all-hearing and all-knowing. Allah guaranteed that if the enemy wanted to deceive the Prophet Muhammad, Allah would be his protector, strengthening him with his help and the support of the believers. Even though the Prophet Muhammad gave away all the wealth on earth, it would not be able to unite the hearts of believers, but it is Allah who unites their hearts because He is the most mighty and the most wise. Allah also emphasized that He was sufficient as a protector for the Prophet Muhammad and the believers who followed him, and encouraged the Prophet Muhammad to awaken the fighting spirit of the believers. Allah gives an example that with patience a few believers can defeat a much larger number of enemies, because Allah relieves Muslims who have weaknesses by giving victory to those who are patient, according to His permission. Legal provisions concerning prisoners of war, as mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 67 to 71. Allah emphasizes that a prophet should not have prisoners before successfully paralyzing his enemies on earth, because the goal of a prophet is to seek the reward of the hereafter, not worldly wealth. Allah, as the Almighty and All-Wise, has established provisions that prevent Muslims from great torment and allow them to use the spoils of war as lawful food while remaining pious to Him. The Prophet Muhammad was asked to give a message to the prisoners of war that if there is goodness in their hearts, Allah will give them a reward that is better and forgive them. But if they intend to betray, it means they have betrayed Allah, and Allah will give power to the Prophet Muhammad over them as His wise action. The event of Hijrah as a test of faith, mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal verses 72 to 75. Allah explains that those who believe, emigrate, and strive with their wealth and lives in the way of Allah, and who provide shelter and assistance to the muhajirin, protect one another. For those who believe but have not migrated, there is no obligation for Muslims to protect them unless they seek help in religious matters. The disbelievers help each other, and if Muslims do not obey Allah's command to protect each other, then there will be chaos and great corruption on earth. Those who believe, emigrate, and strive in the way of Allah, and who provide shelter and assistance to the muhajirin, they are the true believers who will receive forgiveness and noble sustenance. Those who believe, migrate, and strive with the Prophet Muhammad, and those who have family ties, have different rights according to the provisions in the Book of Allah, because Allah is all-knowing of all things. Conclusion of Surah Al-Anfal. Surah Al-Anfal discusses various aspects related to warfare, especially the Battle of Badr, which is considered a turning point in the history of Islam and humanity. Much of the content of this chapter focuses on the relationship between peace and warfare, and the behavior of the disbelievers, hypocrites, and some Muslims whose faith is weak during the conflict. This chapter emphasizes that Allah always helps believers and destroys disbelievers and hypocrites in accordance with His Sunnah, which has been valid throughout history, as happened to Pharaoh and his people. In the context of faith, this chapter emphasizes Allah's protection for people who trust in themselves, the importance of unity between them, and the role of angels in helping Muslim troops in the Battle of Badr. The laws outlined include the distribution of spoils of war, the prohibition on retreat in battle, and the obligation to obey leaders and maintain mandates. The stories in this chapter describe the reluctance of some Muslims to participate in the Battle of Badr, the atmosphere among Muslims before and during the war, and the conflict between the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, and the polytheists and Jews. Apart from that, this chapter explains the meaning of faith, the signs and characteristics of believers, as well as the sunnatullah that applies to individuals and society.